Recently, I've been consuming a decent amount of content about potential upcoming Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG ban lists. And a lot of this content is put out by high-level pro players talking about how they envision the ban list evolving. And I did a video recently talking about rotation and pseudo-rotation and how Yu-Gi-Oh's ban list philosophy kind of informs that kind of pseudo-rotation. So a lot of the takes you see people having in these videos are I think a bit strange if you are coming from a different game, because Yu-Gi-Oh does approach bans as a way to fundamentally shift the format, even if the format is not in and of itself unhealthy. I think currently people feel that the Josh format is very healthy and pretty fun. On top of that, I think a lot of the gameplay is pretty good, and the decks are liked. But obviously, that's going to change, and so you're seeing these videos of people talking about how they envision the ban list evolving, things that they envision going on the list or potentially coming off the list. And one of the takes that I was most struck by, and this was something that I saw repeated by a couple of different players who are clearly very high level, was this notion that Liger Dancer, Lunalite's boss monster, should go to 1, that it should be limited. And obviously, if you know anything about me, you know that I like Lunalite. I think it is at this point, it's one of my most played decks. I think the deck is super fun and interesting. But putting that bias aside, I do just think that change would just kill the deck. It's funny. I've seen in particular Joshua Schmidt arguing that Lunalite to 1 or that Liger Dancer to 1 doesn't kill the deck. It just makes it fair. But one Liger Dancer doesn't win enough games, and especially in a universe where we're gonna have Cool Tune as the best deck in the format that gets potentially 3 extra deck rips. You just can't. The deck won't survive. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about his reasoning for why he wants Liger Dancer to go to 1 and why he would like Lunalite to be slightly less present in the meta. And I'm not gonna argue whether or not specifically the Lunalite example is a good one, but I do think that his reasoning is an interesting thing that we can talk about with regards to sideboards and sideboards' impact on the way that designers are allowed to design archetypes. So Josh Schmidt's point about, or Joshua Schmidt, sorry, point about Lunalite is that the way that the deck operates fundamentally forces you to build your deck differently because it is operating on such a different axis from the rest of the format. You have to include outs to the towers, basically. And if you don't put those outs either in your extra deck or in your side deck, then you are in a very rough spot, is his argument against Lunalite.
Deck to talk about is Lunalite. The first way is you think Lunalite is fine and shouldn't be hit at all, which I think is, looking at results, I think is reasonable. I think Lunalite has not been that successful. Lunalite is a deck that's part of the format. I think it deserves to be hit personally, though, because it is really format warping, right? Even if Lunalite isn't that popular and you only play against it once per tournament or whatever, it's really format warping, and it forces people to include answers in their decks, and it's really weird. It puts people in a really weird position when they're building their decks. So I would like to see Liger go to 1. This card is not getting banned.
Whether or not that's entirely correct or not, I think it is something that you could discuss ad nauseum. But he's certainly correct that Lunalite is a deck that exerts metagame pressure in the way that you are forced to build your sideboards. And I don't think the deck is broken per se, and I don't think that's what anyone is really arguing. It's more so that the deck's existence is annoying in the way that it forces you to make deck building choices. And I guess there's a question of, should decks be balanced around the way that they force deck building choices? I'm pretty new to Yu-Gi-Oh, so I couldn't think of a ton of other examples akin to Lunalite. I assume that, for example, when Pearly was one of the best things to be doing, that was similar, but I think that was a little bit different because Pearly was one of the best archetypes in the metagame, and as a result, including concessions to outing Noir was like a more reasonable thing to do, like to outing the big pearly towers was a more reasonable thing to do because you were going to see it more often. Other and I couldn't really think of other examples that are like close enough to me that I would have enough context. Like I guess maybe in the Tempai format or when Tempai first came out, you had to make choices. But again, that deck was like tier 1, not a kind of like tier 2 or tier 3 strategy that really influenced the way that you had to build your deck. So let me know in the comments if there are a bunch of those that I'm missing out on. But to me, this concept seems less common in Yu-Gi-Oh! And maybe that is part of what's driving this narrative that it's a negative experience. But this is actually something that has historically been a pretty prominent part of Magic's Eternal formats game design. So there are a couple of archetypes that you can point to immediately that really stand out in this regard, in the sense that they are balanced around the notion that if you do not have specific sideboard cards or main deck cards, you could be including these cards in your main deck too, that's fine, but typically we think of them as sideboard cards. If you're not playing specific sideboard cards, then the matchup is going to be like 75-25, 60-40. It's going to be really, really bad. But if you include the sideboard cards and you make the choice not to lose to these archetypes, then you can bring those matchups almost swung the entire other way. So let's talk about a couple of these examples. One of the biggest examples that I think you can point to is the Dredge archetype. This is, for my Yu-Gi-Oh players, this is actually like kind of akin to Tearlaments in Magic. These are cards that have the keyword Dredge. Dredge is a keyword that is keyword with a number, and essentially what it is when you would draw a card, you can instead mill the number of cards indicated by the Dredge amount from the top of your deck and return the card from your graveyard instead. And this mechanic was not designed to be a like degenerate combo mechanic. This is one that they really missed on how it was going to work. The idea behind the mechanic was like that it was a grindy tool to basically make it so that you could guarantee that you were recurring these kind of like medium to medium plus creatures at the expense of like potentially decking yourself eventually. And it came in green-black Golgari, which had a bunch of graveyard synergies. So like the initial idea was that you would enable like incidental synergies. But obviously in practice, and Yu-Gi-Oh players will not be surprised to hear this, you know, milling yourself a ton enables some pretty degenerate stuff, and Dredge is no exception. So there are 2 to 3 formats where Dredge is really popular. Let's talk about the one where it really, really, really is like format defining, and that's Vintage. So in Vintage, there's Bazaar of Baghdad, a land that you can tap to draw 2 cards and then discard 3 cards. This, coupled with Dredgers, allows you to rip through your deck as early as the second turn of the game. Sometimes even you can do some machinations to get going on turn 1 with the Bazaar of Baghdad. And as a result, the Dredge deck in Vintage is incredibly consistent. It is going to mill itself and then be able to put a wide variety of creatures into play from the graveyard, and then be able to subsequently use those creatures to cast Cabal therapies that you've also milled to rip your opponent's hand apart. And typically game 1 Dredge games, if it goes well for the Dredge pilot, involve them putting like 20 to 30 power in play on the second or third turn of the game, discarding 4 cards from your hand. And these decks are even in Vintage reaching for a bunch of the free interaction in the format, so they even can typically disrupt 1 or 2 of your disruptions or disrupt your proactive game plan. The deck is incredibly powerful. Similarly, in Legacy, it's not quite as strong because Bazaar of Baghdad is obviously not legal in that format, but there are similar Dredge decks in Legacy. They are lower power. They have at various times been more powerful, but Vintage is really the format where you would really point to Dredge as being this metagame staple. But it's been allowed to continue to exist in the Vintage format for 2 reasons. One, Vintage is kind of like the last bastion of doing broken stuff in Magic, and their desire to do something like ban Bazaar of Baghdad is exceptionally low, even if the gameplay patterns around it are not loved by some portion of the community. There are Dredge pilots, and they love the deck, and in Vintage in particular, you're not going to just take that deck away from people. But the other reason, and this is a very justifiable reason, is that the deck is balanceable by players making concerted deck building choices in their sideboard and in their main deck. Because the deck relies so heavily on the graveyard, if you are able to interact with the graveyard with, say, something like Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Void, cards that just fully exile the graveyard forever, and in the case of Leyline of the Void, like, come into play on turn 0, it's not put on the stack, you can't interact with it, you have to destroy it if you're the Dredge pilot. These kinds of cards are so high impact against Dredge that the deck has kind of been allowed to continue to exist. And there is this metagame dance of when you are going to a tournament, you have to make decisions based on how much Dredge you think might be there, or you might just decide, based on my personality traits, I'm gonna crash out if I lose to Dredge, and so as a result, I'm just gonna put Dredge sideboard cards so that I can at least be sure that matchup is going to be shored up if I run into it. Similarly, a more modern example of this that is powerful but not a combo deck in the same way is Affinity. This is something that has particularly been prevalent in Magic's modern format. Affinity has been kind of a staple of that format for the entirety that it's existed. The idea behind Affinity is that it is a deck that gets to leverage a variety of powerful artifacts in order to put in play a number of creatures quite cheap. In the past, it has operated using cards like Cranial Plating to boost up the attack of its creatures to get in for a lot of damage, and then more recently it's been leaning on cards like Kappa Cannoneer, which are these incredibly disruptive, or not disruptive, but hard to disrupt threats. They get quite large and win the game pretty quickly as well. And the whole idea behind Affinity is that it was this fast aggro deck that for a long time actually kind of like broke the rules of engagement of Modern, in the sense that the historical rules of engagement in Modern is that it was supposed to be a format where both players got to turn 4, or that I guess one player sometimes only got to turn 3, but that you shouldn't be winning the game before turn 4. And Affinity had several types of draws at different times in its existence where it could win the game on turn 3. It even would have nut draws where it could win the game on turn 2. That was uncommon, but turn 3 was not. Turn 3 was a totally reasonable clock to get to if you had like a powerful Arcbound Ravager, Inkmoth Nexus draw. Like you could win the game on that turn. And so this deck for a long time was not loved by the entire community, but in the same way kept around with the premise that, there are a ton of extremely potent anti-artifact cards that fundamentally shut down the way the deck works. The classic example of this, all the way basically back to the start of Modern's history, is Stony Silence. This is a 1 and a white enchantment that just says artifacts can't activate their abilities. This Affinity has an exceptionally challenging time beating this card. It turns out that when you can't activate any of the abilities of these things that you're putting on to the battlefield, like, they're largely just a bunch of 1/1s, and so your deck kind of sputters and dies. You also don't get the explosive fast mana elements that Mox Opal allowed. So yeah, like, there are a bunch of anti-Affinity cards like Shatterstorm that destroyed all artifacts, Creeping Corrosion, destroy all artifacts for 4 mana. Like, there were just a ton of these haymaker sideboard cards that would take out Affinity players. And again, the notion was, okay, we're okay with this existing, and when you go to a Modern tournament, your calculus basically has to be, how much Affinity do I expect to be in the room? And if you were someone who was thinking about playing Affinity, the idea was, okay, you might have to kind of like pick your spots here, wait for a week where you think the amount of Affinity hate is going to be lower than average. And as a result, that theoretically creates some interesting interplay around metagaming, around deck building decisions, and around like actually balancing the format. Because you're essentially saying, you know what, we're willing to allow these decks that have higher than acceptable game 1 win rates, and Dredge and Affinity both certainly for the vast majority of the time that they have been playable in formats, have had higher than average game 1 win percents. But the idea is that they're balanced around the fact that their game 2 and 3 win percent, their post sideboard win percent, is much lower. It's a lot worse. And so it's pretty common in Magic's history to design decks in this way. The question, though, is it a good thing? Is it healthy to design archetypes and metagames in this way, where you have singular decks that drive so much of the sideboarding decision-making process, that have such vastly disproportionate game 1 and games 2 and 3 win rates? Like, do those make for well-designed formats? Do those make for healthy formats? And I think that if you look at modern designs of trading card games, most designers seem to be coming to the conclusion that they do not. That it is, in fact, a frustrating experience. When I was scripting out this video and kind of trying to create an outline of the various decks that I was going to talk about, I went and I was like, I'm going to go find modern examples of this paradigm. And if you can think of some, please tell me, because I'm very interested. But certainly in Magic's current context, it's not something that we see as being an exceptionally common design philosophy. You don't see decks, other than the ones I've already talked about, that are really cropping up that have this disparate of a game 1 and game 2-3 delta. The one example I could come up with is like the modern Storm deck is still like a lot worse post sideboard, and combo decks as a whole, I think, tend to be the biggest candidates for this, where they have a strong game 1 win rate because a lot of the time people are playing cards in their main deck that are good against the field that tend to be bad against combo decks. Things like removal are going to be just like fundamentally useless against spell-based combo. But in Magic's context, like in Standard, certainly you don't see this design philosophy being executed tremendously often. In fact, they actively try to shy away from it. You saw that with the bans to the Omniscience deck that was never truly oppressive in Standard because it was being played at the same time as the VV mono red format. But when they made the bans that got rid of VV and mono red, they also made bans to that Omniscience deck because they clearly didn't want it to become one of the best things to be doing, even though that would be an example of a deck that you could target in your sideboarding approach. And I couldn't think of examples in other games that I play, like Star Wars Unlimited, Riftbound. Neither of these games that I had archetypes that I could think of as being like especially balanced around their susceptibility to sideboard cards. And if you look at a lot of these modern games, they're not designing these super haymakery sideboard cards anyway. Like, you're not seeing cards like Stony Silence that fundamentally shut down an entire pillar of the way that the game is designed. I realized after I recorded and when I started editing that I can't actually think of one other example of this in a modern game, which is in Star Wars Unlimited. There is this card Hyperspace Disaster, which destroys all space units. And there are decks in Star Wars Unlimited that are like what we would describe as, like, we call them space race decks. The idea is that they don't play basically any ground units. They're only committing to the space arena. And the idea around that is that you can be dominant in one arena and potentially end the game before your opponent has the ability to stabilize, because a lot of decks play very few space units, if any. And so if you can overload that arena, you can win the game. And a card like Hyperspace Disaster is clearly Fantasy Flight's attempt to print sideboard cards that would curtail the efficacy of those sorts of strategies. I will say, as an aside, that currently there are two decks that commit pretty heavily to space that are relatively powerful in the metagame, and they aren't really kept in check by Hyperspace Disaster. So I'm not sure it's a successful attempt to do that, but it is an attempt, and it does exist, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it. And I think that's for multiple reasons. One, with a smaller card pool, these kinds of effects are less necessary. But two, I think it is also clearly just a frustrating play pattern that many people have identified. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that it is aggravating to basically feel like you have to play roulette about what your pairings in a tournament are going to be, where, you know, you might bring 6 sideboard cards for Affinity, or 6 sideboard cards for Dredge, or 6 sideboard cards for Storm, and then not pair into it. In the same way that in the example we started with here against like Lunalite, you might put Lava Golem in your sideboard, you might put the big Link 5 that you can IP into in your sideboard, in your extra deck, as a way to try and out the Liger Dancers, and never play against Lunalite and just feel like those slots are wasted. And I think that this opens up a more extensive discussion about the nature of sideboards and the way that we play tournaments anyway. I've seen some amount of dialogue amongst Yu-Gi-Oh! Content creators about either playing best of one only or playing without sideboards, and I do think that this is kind of an interesting concept. It only works in certain games, obviously. Like in Magic, you would not want to play in a world where there are not sideboards. The way that strategies are developed in Magic, they are coming at you from such fundamentally different angles that being able to tweak and adjust your deck in between games to be more curated to a matchup, I think is important. And I also think that as time has gone on, the way in which they are designing cards has made sideboarding decisions more interesting, not less. But I do agree that this idea of, okay, I'm going to a tournament and I'm building my sideboard, and my sideboard is just like 15 cards that are specifically good against one archetype. Like I've brought 6 anti-storm cards and 6 anti-affinity cards, and then I've got 3 other just kind of like generic mid-range cards that I'm going to take out when I need to go a little bit bigger. Like that's not necessarily the most interesting sideboarding discussion to be having. So at the same time, in Magic, I think you couldn't do it. I think currently in Magic, a lot of the sideboarding discussions are very interesting, and honestly, like sideboarding guides and analyses over what the 15th sideboard card is going to be in a variety of different formats are real drivers for why that game is interesting and why people enjoy those formats so much. So I would not advocate for it in a Magic context. But I will just say anecdotally, like I play Star Wars Unlimited like on a semi-weekly basis. I sometimes miss, but you know, the weeks that I go there, even when we are playing in best of 3, a lot of the people who I play with don't bring sideboards. I'm often building my deck like 1 hour before the tournament, and I don't always finish my sideboard. And by and large, those games still feel very reasonable. Playing best of 3 with limited or no sideboarding has not felt like it fundamentally alters what the metagame looks like, or what the best decks are, or how you should be approaching things. And I think that more games certainly could be targeting this as a design space. You can even look at a game like Riftbound, which has really cut back on the amount of sideboard space that you even get. You only get 8 slots in Riftbound. They're really trying to not allow it to just kind of be a way to fundamentally alter your deck. And again, in Star Wars Unlimited, despite it being a 50 card main deck, it's only a 10 card sideboard, so it's not a massive sideboard either. One thing that you do lose out on when you reduce sideboard size and or potentially you talk about playing games with no sideboard is you do lose out on like fun kind of jukes, like where in Magic it's not like tremendously common, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that your sideboard is just a 15 card secondary strategy that you wholesale swap in and out with something in your main deck to kind of try and get out of the way of these hate cards. One thing that came up a decent amount in a recent Legacy format was that the blue-black kind of like tempo reanimator deck that was too powerful was doing things like being a reanimator deck in game 1, and then in game 2 it was sideboarding in 10 cards, sideboarding out all of its reanimator cards or most of its reanimator cards, and becoming just a generic blue-black tempo deck in the sideboarded games. And I do think that you would lose out on that if you decided to play no sideboards, best of 1 only. But or best of 1 only. There are also, I think, considerations for how you would have to build main decks if you were going to play with no sideboards or you were only going to play best of one that I think have positive and negatives as well. So we actually have in the Yu-Gi-Oh context a pretty good example of what this is like, because obviously Master Duel, which is a different format in terms of card pool, is best of one, and you only ever play best of one on Master Duel. And as a result, the way that you are obligated to build your deck, I actually think has kind of interesting interplay, forces you to have interesting decisions about building your deck to have a good enough going first win rate without completely assassinating your game 2 or your going second win rate, or vice versa. You could obviously in Master Duel, and people do this, like load up on cards that are best going second, choose to go second when you win the coin toss, and allow, and obviously a lot of the times your opponent is going to choose to go first. Like you can do that's a thing that you can do. I think that outside of like very specific strategies, that's not been necessarily correct, but it's cool that you have the option. But what it means is that you are like running into these situations where you are registering like 5 Charmies in your main deck, which I don't think is something that you would do in the TCG, because it's not very good for your game 1 going first win rate. And I do actually think that balance of forcing players to make choices around which non-engine they're going to play and how much non-engine they're going to play does have some merit. There are also, though, like negative elements to it. In particular, this really like further exacerbates the power of decks that are particularly strong, either going first, or exacerbates the power of decks that have unique requirements. One thing that I noticed, like when I was playing like Mitsurugi FTK, I climbed really quickly, and I went on like a 15 game win streak at one point, something like that, because that deck had such a high going first win rate that I just had a nice streak of winning like 6 coin flips in a row or 8 coin flips in a row at one point, and I won all of those going first games because my going first my deck was constructed to win going first, and I did lose more games going second, certainly, and I mean every deck does, but in a best of one context, I think you're almost even more incentivized to slant your deck towards having going first win rate. So let's bring it all back to where we started. Is a change to the ban list to limit Liger Dancer to 1 something that makes sense? Is that something that Konami should be looking at to do in the TCG? And I think I would say yes, probably. As much as I like the Lunalite deck and as much as I enjoy playing it, like I'm not going to sit here and be like intellectually dishonest about the arguments. I think that Joshua Smith's take on it makes sense. The argument that forcing yourself to build your deck in a way where you have to have outs to this strategy that you might play once or twice is frustrating. So I could see them making changes to the archetype for this reason. Do I think specifically? I guess maybe I should elaborate. I think his argument and his rationale is good. I'm less convinced that literal Lunalite needs to be changed, I guess I should say. And that has more to do with the fact that I think that the deck is more disruptible than he is giving it credit. As someone who's played like quite a lot of it, like a lot of the argument for why there should be changes to it seems to be centered around the idea that like beating 2 Ligers is difficult, but like if you let your opponent make 2 Ligers, like you were losing to a lot of the decks in the format anyway, because getting to 2 Ligers basically requires like them letting you have it all, or you having like a really juiced hand. And I think against comparable hands in the format, you are also dead. You just got to like wiggle a little bit while their layered interaction kills you. And maybe because he's such a good player, He can sometimes outplay that layered interaction and win games he quote unquote shouldn't. And against like a deck like Lunalite, where the towers require such specific answers, he can't. And so that's why he in particular finds it frustrating. I'm not sure, but I do think that the overall philosophy for why he's advocating for that change does make sense. We don't design archetypes in many other games to be balanced around their susceptibility to sideboard cards anymore. And I think that that is for the best. If you are trying to force players to guess what they're going to play against, you're fundamentally just going to cause players to have negative tournament experiences when they guess wrong. And I think that when that guess wrong results in a 5% win rate change, like you don't bring enough cards for a heavy mid-range format, or you don't bring enough cards to defend against a heavy aggro format, that's fine. But when that win rate discrepancy is like 20% because you didn't include 4 cards to have outs to Liger Dancer, or you didn't bring your Affinity sideboard cards, then, you know, obviously that is going to cause some frustration. So that's all I got for this week. For this video. I think this is a really interesting topic, and please let me know in the comments if you can think of other decks that are balanced around their susceptibility to sideboard cards. I think that there must be more in other games. I'm certain that especially other games with long histories like just have to have decks that I'm not aware of or I'm not thinking of, but certainly I couldn't think of more than just the examples I came up with in this video here. So I'd love to hear from you about that. I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who is supporting over on the Patreon. Their names are on screen right now. I really appreciate it. If you want your name here, or if you want to support the content I do, you can check out the link in the description. And with all that being said, and all that discussion around Lunalites and sideboard cards, I'll see you in the next one.